Julian Thorne sat in the deep quiet of the Volpe room. It was his room, in his restaurant. The city outside screamed and clawed, a beast of steel and noise, but in here, there was only the low hum of power. The clink of silver on porcelain. The scent of old leather and older money. Opposite him, Isabella smiled. Her hair was the color of champagne, her eyes the blue of a frozen lake. She was beautiful in the way a perfectly cut diamond was beautiful. Flawless. Cold. Expensive. His fiancée. To his right, Marco stood, silent as a shadow. His lieutenant. His right hand for 30 years. Marco's face was a roadmap of scars and loyalty, and his eyes missed nothing. Tonight, they missed nothing. Julian swirled the dark red wine in his glass, watching the liquid cling to the crystal. He was a man in his late 50s, his hair more salt than pepper, his face a testament to a life lived without compromise. He ran his city's underworld with the detached precision of a surgeon. His rules were law. His word was iron. He was untouchable. Isabella was talking, her voice a soft melody that usually soothed him. Something about a charity gala. About seating charts and the mayor's wife. Julian nodded, his mind elsewhere. He was thinking of the shipment coming in at the docks, of the trouble with the Byrne family, of the quiet legacy he was trying to build. A life beyond the chaos. Isabella represented that life. A respectable, beautiful wife. A future sanitized of the blood and dirt of his past. Then the door opened. It did not swing open with the deference of a waiter. It did not click open with the authority of a trusted associate. It creaked open. A woman stood there, silhouetted against the dim light of the main dining hall. She was a ghost. Thin, frail, her clothes worn and out of place. Her hair was a wisp of white, her skin pale as paper. She had somehow slipped past the guards at the front, past the sentinels posted in the hallway. An impossibility. Marco's hand went instantly to the inside of his jacket. The two guards stationed by the door tensed, their bodies coiling like springs. Ready to erase this intrusion. Isabella's smile faltered. A flicker of annoyance crossed her perfect features. "Julian, who is that?" The old woman took a shuffling step into the room. Her eyes, wide and dark in her gaunt face, scanned the occupants. They passed over Marco. They passed over Isabella. They landed on Julian. And they held. She took another step, her breathing a ragged, painful sound in the sudden, absolute silence. She was clutching something in her hand. A small, rectangular object. One of the guards started, his voice a low growl. "You can't be in here." The woman ignored him. Her focus was a laser beam fixed on Julian. She moved toward the table, each step an act of supreme will. He could see the tremor in her hands, the feverish glint in her eyes. She was sick. Very sick. Marco moved to intercept her. "Boss." Julian did something he had not done in decades. He held up a hand. A simple gesture. A command that stopped his entire world on its axis. "Stop." Marco froze, his expression a mask of confusion. The guards remained rooted to their spots. The old woman reached the table. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the object. She leaned forward, her breath a whisper of dust and decay. She smelled of sickness and desperation. Her eyes flicked to Isabella, just for a second. A look of profound, chilling animosity. Then back to Julian. "Don't trust the blonde," she rasped, her voice a dry crackle. The words hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. Isabella recoiled as if struck. "What did you say? How dare you?" But the old woman's message was delivered. Her strength gave out. Her eyes rolled back, and she crumpled to the floor, the small object falling from her grasp and skittering across the polished wood. She lay there. A heap of old bones and worn fabric. Very still. Julian stared at the spot where she had fallen. The world had tilted. The quiet of his room was shattered, not by noise, but by a whisper. A warning from a ghost. He pushed his chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the silence. He ignored Isabella's gasp, ignored Marco's questioning gaze. He knelt beside the woman. An act of deference. An act of shock. An act no one in this room had ever seen Julian Thorne perform. His eyes fell on the object she had dropped. It was a photograph. Faded, creased, its corners soft with time. He reached for it, his hand, a hand that had signed death warrants and built an empire, trembling slightly. He turned it over. And the world stopped. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about loyalty, love, and the ghosts we leave behind. Like this video if you believe some warnings are worth listening to. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now, let's get back to the story. Julian Thorne was a name whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence. He was a relic from an older time, a man who had clawed his way up from the gutter with nothing but his fists and a mind that saw angles no one else did. He took over the South Side docks when he was just 25, dismantling the old guard piece by piece, not with wanton violence, but with strategic, brutal efficiency. His reputation was built on two unshakable pillars: his word was his bond, and his retribution was absolute. If Julian gave you his word, it was as good as gold. If you crossed him, you ceased to exist. It was a simple, binary world. But beneath the armor of the crime lord was a man governed by a strict, personal code. He did not deal in the kind of filth that preyed on the weak. He did not tolerate harm coming to children or innocents caught in the crossfire. His operations, logistics, gambling, construction, were dirty, but they had boundaries. These boundaries were what separated him, in his own mind, from the animals. This code was forged in the fire of his youth. A past he had buried so deep he sometimes convinced himself it was a dream. A girl named Elena. She was not from his world. She was the daughter of a baker, a girl with flour on her hands and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. They had met one summer, a lifetime ago. A secret, impossible love. He was a young man with blood on his knuckles and ambition in his heart. She was everything good and clean he knew he could never have. He had made a choice back then. To protect her, he had to leave her. To climb the ladder he was destined to climb, he couldn't have her light dragging him back into a world he was trying to escape in a different way. He walked away, breaking his own heart to spare hers. He never saw her again. Years later, he heard she had died. A sickness that took her quickly. The news had reached him through the grapevine, a hollowed-out fact that had carved a permanent void in his soul. He had built an empire, but the foundation was hollow. His engagement to Isabella was an attempt to finally pave over that void. She was from a good family, albeit one whose fortune had dwindled. The marriage was a merger of his power and her social standing. It was a practical arrangement. Logical. He told himself it was what a man in his position did. Find a suitable queen to preside over his kingdom. He had convinced himself he was content. Until the ghost walked in. The photograph in his hand was a ghost itself. It showed two people. A young man, barely 20, with dark, intense eyes and a defiant set to his jaw. Him. And a girl, her head resting on his shoulder, a radiant smile on her face, her dark hair falling over her eyes. Elena. The world narrowed to the four corners of that faded image. The sounds of the room, Isabella's indignant sputtering, Marco's low voice on the phone calling for a doctor, faded into a dull roar. He knew who the old woman was now. Maria. Elena's mother. He hadn't seen her in nearly 40 years, but the resemblance to her daughter was still there, hidden beneath the ravages of age and illness. He looked from the photograph to the unconscious woman on the floor. Her face was peaceful now, the lines of pain and desperation momentarily smoothed away. She had spent what little strength she had left to come here. To find him. To deliver a two-word warning. Don't trust the blonde. His gaze lifted, moving past the photo, past Maria, and settled on Isabella. She was standing now, her arms crossed, her face a mask of controlled fury and disgust. "Julian, this is absurd. Get this person out of here. She's probably drunk or insane. To think she could just walk in here and..." Her voice trailed off as she met his eyes. The look on his face was one she had never seen. It was not the cool, calculating gaze of the businessman. It was not the quiet, detached affection of her fiancé. It was the look of a man staring at a complete stranger. The room was a tableau of conflict. On one side, Isabella, the perfect, polished future. On the other, a dying woman from a buried past, clutching a memory. And in the middle, Julian, holding the proof that his past was not dead at all. His mind was a storm. Every instinct he had honed over a lifetime of survival screamed at him. This was a breach. A security failure. A sign of weakness. His world demanded he eliminate the disruption, seal the crack, and move on. Business was business. Emotion was a liability. But this wasn't business. This was Elena's mother. The memory of Elena's smile in the photograph was more real than the diamond on Isabella's finger. The desperation in Maria's voice was more potent than any contract he had ever signed. He remembered Elena's stories about her mother. A proud, strong woman who made the best cannoli in the neighborhood, who loved her daughter with a fierce, protective fire. For that woman to be reduced to this, a frail, desperate messenger, something was terribly wrong. Something beyond just poverty or illness. The warning. It was too specific. Too pointed. Don't trust the blonde. He looked at Isabella. Her blonde hair seemed to catch the light, a perfect halo around her perfect face. A face that was now twisted with impatience and contempt for the woman on the floor. There was no compassion in her eyes. No concern. Only annoyance that her perfect evening had been spoiled. He had seen that look before. On the faces of rivals who saw people as pawns. On the faces of men who believed their status put them above common decency. He had never seen it on the face of someone he was supposed to love. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an awakening. Julian rose slowly to his feet. He carefully placed the photograph inside his jacket, over his heart. A place it hadn't occupied in a lifetime. Marco was off the phone. "Doctor is on his way. My men will meet him downstairs." "No," Julian said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "Not downstairs. Bring him here. And bring a stretcher. She's not to be jostled." He turned to his guards. "You too. You will escort her with the doctor to my private clinic. The one on the West End. Dr. Evans knows the protocol. Tell him she is my guest. She is to have the best room, the best care. Spare no expense. Is that understood?" The guards, accustomed to orders involving threats and logistics, looked momentarily stunned. "Yes, boss. She is to be treated with the same respect you would show my own mother," Julian added, his voice dropping lower. The finality in his tone left no room for questions. He then turned his gaze back to Isabella. The warmth was gone. All of it. His eyes were chips of ice. "The evening is over," he said. It was not a suggestion. Isabella's mouth opened, then closed. She saw the wall that had come up between them. A wall built in the span of 5 minutes. "Julian, I don't understand. You can't possibly be taking that vagrant seriously." "I am," he said flatly. "Marco will see you home." "I'm your fiancé," she protested, her voice rising. "We were having dinner. You're choosing her over me." Julian just looked at her. He didn't need to answer. His silence was the answer. It was colder and more definitive than any word he could have spoken. Defeated, her face flushed with humiliation and fury, Isabella snatched her purse from the table. She shot a venomous glare at the unconscious woman on the floor, then at Julian. Without another word, she stormed out of the room, Marco following silently behind her. Julian was alone with the ghost and her mother. He waited until the medics had arrived, overseeing their careful work as they placed Maria onto a stretcher. He watched them wheel her away, his guards flanking them like a presidential detail. Only when the room was empty again did he move. He walked to the window, looking out at the glittering, indifferent city. He pulled out his phone. He did not call his usual contacts. He scrolled to a number he had not used in years. A number for a man known only as the Ghost. An investigator so discreet, so thorough, that he didn't officially exist. The Ghost answered on the first ring, his voice a dry rasp. "Thorne. I have a job for you," Julian said, his voice low. "I'm retired." "You're not," Julian countered. "I need everything on a person. Isabella Dubois. My fiancée." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The Ghost knew the significance of that name. "Everything," Julian repeated, his voice hard as granite. "Her family. Her finances. Her friends. Every school she went to, every place she ever lived. I want to know who she was before she was Isabella Dubois. I want to know what she had for breakfast on the day she was born. Dig. And don't stop until you hit bone." "This is unusual," the Ghost said, the surprise evident even in his monotone voice. "Personal." "That's why I'm calling you," Julian said. He looked down at the street, where the ambulance carrying Maria was pulling away, its lights silent. "And do it fast. It seems I'm on a deadline." He hung up the phone. The investigation began not with a whisper, but with a silent detonation. The Ghost, a man named Caspian who had once been the top intelligence analyst for a government that no longer existed, moved through the digital and physical world with an unnerving fluidity. He started with the surface. Isabella Dubois, born in Lyon, France. Daughter of a mid-level diplomat and an art historian. Educated in the finest Swiss boarding schools. Moved to the United States for university. A clean, pristine history. A life of quiet privilege. It was too clean. Caspian's first report came to Julian 24 hours later, delivered not by email or text, but by a nondescript courier who handed him a plain manila envelope and vanished. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The birth certificate is a forgery. High quality. State level. The hospital in Lyon has no record of her or her mother. The diplomat father died 10 years ago, but his service records show he was stationed in Asia for his entire career. He never had a daughter. Julian read the words, his face impassive. He felt no shock. Only a cold, grim confirmation. Maria's warning had been a single match, and now he was watching the inferno begin to build. He was at the clinic, sitting in a chair by Maria's bedside. She was stable, sleeping under light sedation. The doctors had confirmed what he already knew. She was dying. Cancer. Aggressive and far too advanced. They gave her weeks, maybe a month with dedicated care. He looked at her frail form, the tubes and wires that tethered her to this world. Someone had let this happen to her. Someone had watched her wither away. He sent a single-word message back to Caspian. Deeper. The next report came 2 days later. This one was thicker. It contained photographs and financial records. Caspian had peeled back the first layer of the lie. Isabella Dubois was an identity created 15 years ago. Before that, she didn't exist. But Caspian had found a loose thread. A wire transfer from a dormant account linked to the Dubois identity, sent 5 years ago to a struggling artist in Brooklyn. The artist was a forger. Not of money, but of life. He specialized in creating identities for people who needed to disappear and reappear as someone else. Under intense, unspoken pressure from one of Caspian's associates, the artist talked. He remembered the woman. Blonde, cold, and paid in cash. She wanted a history that was sophisticated, European, and untraceable. He gave her Isabella Du Bois. But he remembered her real name. Caterina Molinari. Julian stared at the name. Molinari. The name was a thunderclap from his past. Marco Molinari. A rival from 35 years ago. A vicious, ambitious brute who had tried to take over Julian's burgeoning territory. Molinari had none of Julian's code. He dealt in human misery, targeted families, and saw cruelty as a tool of first resort. Their war had been short and brutal. It ended with Julian dismantling Molinari's entire operation. Marco Molinari himself had simply vanished. The official story was that he fled the country. The truth was buried in the foundations of a dockside warehouse. Julian had assumed that was the end of it. He had cut the head off the snake. He never considered the snake might have had a child. The report contained a photograph of Marco Molinari. And next to it, a grainy photo of a young girl, about 10 years old, with dark hair and angry eyes. His daughter, Caterina. Caspian's note was brief. She would be 38 now. The same age as Isabella. Facial recognition is running comparisons. But I think we have our answer. Julian closed his eyes. The long con. A revenge plot decades in the making. It was patient. It was audacious. It was brilliant. She had gotten closer to him than any enemy ever had. She was in his home, in his life, on his arm. She was poised to become his wife, to gain control of his name, his legacy, and, ultimately, his empire. From the inside. But it still didn't explain one thing. How did Maria know? What was the connection between Elena's mother and the daughter of his vanquished rival? He sent his final instruction to Caspian. Find the link. Maria Rossi. To Caterina Molinari. While he waited, Julian maintained his routine. He went to his office. He took his meetings. He projected an aura of absolute calm. But his men could feel it. The air around him was different. Colder. More dangerous. He had cancelled all his appointments with Isabella, citing a business emergency. Her calls went unanswered. Her texts, filled with growing panic and fury, were ignored. She was being isolated. Cut off. The final report arrived at midnight. Julian was in his study, the faded photograph of him and Elena on the desk in front of him. This envelope was heavy. Inside, Caspian had laid out the final, sickening piece of the puzzle. After her father's demise, Caterina Molinari and her mother had disappeared into poverty. Her mother died a few years later. Caterina grew up with a singular, burning purpose: revenge. She was smart, ruthless, and learned to hide her rage behind a beautiful, charming facade. The connection to Maria was simple and brutal. Maria Rossi, after her daughter Elena's death, had lived a quiet, solitary life in her small apartment in her old neighborhood. Her only income was a small pension. Caterina, in her research to find a way to hurt Julian, had somehow uncovered the story of Elena. A weak point. A ghost from his past. She must have sought out Maria, perhaps under the guise of being a historian or a writer interested in the old neighborhood. But her goal was not information. It was silence. The financial records Caspian had unearthed were damning. For the past 2 years, a series of small, anonymous withdrawals had been made from Maria Ross's bank account. Not large enough to trigger alarms, but steady. A slow, methodical bleed. It was followed by a clerical error at the pension office that suspended her payments. Her heat was turned off for non-payment. Her prescriptions went unfilled. Caterina, the woman who was dining on fine food with Julian, was systematically starving and freezing the mother of the only woman he had ever loved. She was accelerating Maria's illness, ensuring the one person who might recognize her from the old neighborhood, the one person who might hold a piece of Julian's past, would die quietly and be forgotten. But Caterina had underestimated Maria. She had underestimated the strength of a mother's love and the power of a dying wish. Maria must have seen something in Isabella. A flicker of the Molinari anger in her eyes. A name dropped by accident. Or maybe she just sensed the darkness behind the perfect smile. She had put the pieces together. And she had used the last of her life force not to save herself, but to warn him. Julian finished reading the report. He sat in his chair for a long time, the silence of the room pressing in on him. The rage he felt was not hot and explosive. It was a cold, dense thing, a singularity of fury forming in his chest. This was not about a business betrayal. It was not about an attempt on his life or his empire. Katerina had not just trespassed on his territory. She had desecrated a grave. He picked up his phone and called Marco. "Clear my schedule for tomorrow night," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "And set the table in the Volpe room. A table for 2 inch. The plan was simple. There would be no violence. No team of enforcers. Just a conversation. An execution of a different kind." The air in the Volpe room was thick with unspoken words. Isabella, Katerina, sat opposite him. She had dressed with care, a simple but elegant black dress. Her blonde hair was perfect. Her smile was back in place, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were wary, searching his for a clue. For 3 days, he had been a ghost. Now, here he was, having summoned her back to the scene of the disruption. "Julian," she began, her voice a carefully constructed mix of relief and hurt. "I've been so worried. I called, I texted. What's going on? Is it about that woman?" Julian poured her a glass of wine. The same vintage they had been drinking the other night. "She's a very sick lady," he said, his tone conversational. "Her name is Maria Rossi." He watched for a reaction. There was none. Just a polite, feigned look of concern. "Oh, the poor thing. Will she be all right?" "No," Julian said simply. "She's dying. But we're making her comfortable." He took a sip of his own wine. "Funny thing is, she used to live not far from where I grew up. A small world." Katerina's mask was flawless. "It really is." "Her daughter died a long time ago," Julian continued, his eyes locked on hers. "Also from a sickness. Her name was Elena." He saw it then. A flicker. A microscopic tightening around her eyes. The barest hint of recognition. She knew the name. Of course she knew the name. "I knew her," Julian said softly. "A lifetime ago." He let the silence stretch, letting the statement hang in the air between them. "Julian, why are you telling me this?" she asked, trying to steer the conversation back to familiar ground. "Is this why you've been ignoring me? Because of some woman from your past?" She tried for a jealous, wounded tone. "It was a good performance." "Not just any woman," Julian corrected. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the thick manila envelope Caspian had delivered. He placed it on the table between them. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. "I'm telling you this, Katerina," he said, "because you should know whose memory you desecrated." The name hit her like a physical blow. Her face went white. The smile vanished. The blue eyes, once like frozen lakes, were now shattered ice. The mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. In its place was the face from the old photograph. The face of a girl with angry eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, but the words had no conviction. "Don't," Julian said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. "Don't insult my intelligence. You've already insulted my heart." He opened the envelope and slid the first document across the table. Her forged birth certificate. Isabella Dubois. Born in Lyon. A lovely story. He slid the next one. A picture of her father, Marco Molinari. "I'm sure he would have been proud of how close you got. He was never this patient." Her hands were trembling. She stared at the documents, her breathing growing shallow. The trap had been sprung, and she was caught in it. He was a monster, she spat, the rage she had hidden for so long finally breaking free. You killed him. You destroyed my family. Your father was a rabid dog, Julian countered, his voice still level. He preyed on the innocent. He broke every rule. I simply put him down. That was business. I never went after his family. I never went after you. You left me with nothing, she screamed, her voice raw. And you used that nothing to build a lie that put you at my table, Julian said, his voice laced with a cold, terrifying admiration. It was a good plan. Marry the old man, inherit his kingdom, and avenge your father. It was almost perfect. He leaned forward. But you made a mistake. A fatal one. You got greedy. You couldn't just focus on me. You had to go after her. He slid the final papers across the table. Maria Ross's bank statements. The records of her suspended pension. The reports of her utilities being cut off. You found out about Elena. You found her mother. And you decided to erase her. Not with a bullet. That's not your style. You're more creative. You decided to let her freeze and starve to death. Quietly. To make sure no one from the past could ever identify you. Katerina stared at the proof of her cruelty, speechless. You were dining with me on $500 plates of food while she was choosing between heat and medicine, Julian said, his voice a low growl. Did you enjoy your wine, knowing she was drinking cold tap water? Did you sleep well in your 1,000 thread count sheets, knowing she was shivering in her bed? Tears of rage and humiliation streamed down her face. She was nothing. An old woman who would have died anyway. She was everything, Julian corrected, his voice dropping to a whisper. She was the mother of the only woman I ever loved. And her last act on this earth was to protect me from you. He stood up. The meal was untouched. The confrontation was over. Your plan had one flaw, Katerina. You assumed my heart was empty. You were wrong. It was just waiting. She looked up at him, her face a mess of tears and hate. What are you going to do? Julian looked at her for a long moment. He saw the angry little girl. He saw the monster she had become. He felt nothing. No pity. No remorse. Marco, he said, without turning around. The door opened and his lieutenant stepped inside. His face was grim. See Ms. Molinari out, Julian instructed. And make sure she never bothers anyone ever again. The words were a death sentence, delivered with the same dispassion as ordering a car. Katerina's eyes widened in terror. She opened her mouth to plead, to scream, but Marco was already there. He took her arm in a grip of iron. She didn't struggle. She knew it was over. He led her out of the room. The door clicked shut, and the Volpe room was quiet once more. Julian stood alone, the silence now clean. Purged. The threat was permanently closed. The next day, Julian went to the clinic. He walked into Maria's room to find her awake, sitting up slightly. The color had returned to her cheeks, and the frantic, feverish look in her eyes was gone. In its place was a profound and weary peace. She looked at him as he entered, and a small, weak smile touched her lips. He pulled a chair to her bedside and sat down. He didn't need to say anything. She knew. She could see it in the calm that now surrounded him. The storm had passed. It's done, he said quietly. It was all that needed to be said. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Not of sadness, but of relief. Elena, she always said you were a good man. Hidden under all the trouble. Julian looked down at his hands. Hands that had done so much wrong to do what he felt was right. Maria reached a frail hand from under the blanket. In it was the faded photograph of him and Elena. She pressed it into his hand. She never stopped loving you, Maria whispered. Even at the end. She made me promise, if I ever saw you again, to tell you that. He closed his hand around the photograph, the worn edges pressing into his palm. A promise delivered 40 years late. "Thank you, Maria," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had not felt in decades. "For everything. For the warning." "I did it for her," she said simply. "And for the boy she loved." He stayed with her for a long time, the two of them sitting in a comfortable silence, two solitary ships who had found a brief, shared harbor. He told her she would want for nothing. He promised her peace and dignity for the time she had left. As he was getting ready to leave, she looked at him, her gaze clear and searching. "Julian," she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Are you a good man? Or a bad one?" The question hung in the quiet room. The ultimate, impossible question. He thought of the empire he had built, the men he had broken, the lines he had crossed. He thought of the cold resolution he had delivered to Katerina just last night. Then he looked at Maria, at the peace on her face, and he thought of Elena. He gave her the only honest answer he had. "I don't know," he said, his voice quiet and heavy. "But for the past few days, you gave me the chance to be the man your daughter always believed I was." He leaned over and gently kissed her forehead, a gesture of profound, familial respect. Before he left, he placed a small, discreet card on her bedside table. It had a single phone number on it. His private line. "For anything," he said. "Day or night." His protection was now a fortress around her. 1 year later. The autumn leaves were turning, painting the city in shades of gold and rust. Julian Thorne stood in a small, quiet cemetery on the outskirts of the city. A place not found on any map. He stood before two simple headstones, side by side. Elena Rossi. Maria Rossi. Maria had passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 months after their conversation. Julian had handled everything. He had buried her here, next to the daughter she had loved so fiercely. He was the only one who knew this place existed. He had bought the plot of land decades ago, a secret shrine to a life he never lived. He was not the same man he was a year ago. The engagement was a distant, sour memory. The world saw him as more remote, more untouchable than ever. But inside, something had shifted. The hollow foundation of his life now had an anchor. He no longer looked for a queen for his kingdom. He had found something more enduring. Peace. Later, back in his towering office overlooking the city, he sat behind his massive desk. The cold, abstract art that once adorned the walls was gone. The room was stark, minimalist, except for one item. On the corner of his desk, in a simple, elegant silver frame, was the faded photograph. The young man with defiant eyes and the girl with the radiant smile resting her head on his shoulder. It was the only personal object in the entire room. The only thing that mattered. Sometimes, the most profound warnings do not come from intelligence reports or whispers in the underworld. They come from the past, carried on the dying breath of a love that never faded. A mother's final, desperate act of protection proved more powerful than any army or fortress, reminding a man hardened by a lifetime of war that true loyalty is not a contract. It is a bond of the heart, one that even time and death cannot break.